You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is September 10th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which is available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C. from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the latest edition of Around the Horne, the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the Horne, I want to ask you about Israel's attack on Qatar. Yesterday, September 9th, Israel conducted airstrikes in Qatar against Hamas leadership in an unprecedented assassination attempt in the Qatari capital of Doha. According to various news sources, all of the senior leaders targeted in the attack survived, including Khalil al-Hayya, Khaled Meshal, Zahir Jabrin, and others. And while we have not seen a conclusive casualty count as yet, Hamas has stated that the son of acting Politburo chair Khalil al-Hayya was killed along with Hayya's chief of staff, 3 other Hamas officials, and a Qatari internal security force officer. It should be noted that the Palestinian leaders were in Doha for the specific purpose of discussing the latest U.S. ceasefire proposal for Gaza. Of course, we have seen Israel target leaders of Hamas, as well as leaders from Iran, Yemen, and Hezbollah. But Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news? The fact that these Palestinian leaders were called to Doha to discuss the latest peace deal, the fact that Trump apparently notified Qatar in advance of the strikes, and how significant is the fact that this attack took place in Qatar?
This is very ominous. It bids fair to drown the entire region in blood ignited by these wild beasts in Israel, who obviously need to be restrained. There may need to be some sort of regional or international intervention, not only to rescue the Palestinians from genocide, but also to restrain the more bestial elements in Israel itself. With regard to Qatar, it's the second time it's been bombed this year. Recall that during the so-called 12-day war in June 2025, they were bombed by the Iranians. And the Qataris need to ask themselves if their posture as a so-called mediating force in the region is sustainable. That is to say that they house a major U.S. military base, as noted. They house Al Jazeera. And by the way, Israel has been killing Al Jazeera journalists as if they were rabid dogs. And the Qataris are also supposedly close to the European countries to which they supply natural gas in the absence of the supplying of Russian natural gas in the process of being boycotted. I think that it leaves Turkey on the spot. Recall that Turkey is supposed to be one of the closest comrades of the Qatari regime. Recall a few years ago during the Trump 1.0 regime, when the Qataris got into a conflict and a tiff with other Gulf nations, particularly the Saudis. The Turks stepped in and helped to protect this regime. And since then, they've been as thick as thieves. And Mr. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, is busily rolling up the opposition, the Republican People's Party. And he may have to turn his attention away from that deed in order to address Israel, which he has been attacking rhetorically, but not necessarily practically. I think that Mr. Trump is on the spot. There are few in the region who accept this notion that the United States was caught by surprise by this Israeli attack. There are those who suggest that this was akin to the June 2025 attack by the Israelis, whereby if the Israelis had succeeded in decapitating the Hamas leadership, then Mr. Trump would have signed on. But since they did not succeed, he's acting as if he was in the dark. Certainly, U.S. imperialism is caught between two fires. On the one hand, U.S. imperialism has become heavily dependent upon capital from that part of the world. Recall the $400 million plane gifted to Mr. Trump most recently during his recent visit to the region. But at the same time, U.S. imperialism is heavily dependent upon Zionist billionaires, Miriam Adelson, Bill Ackman, etc. And I must say that at the end of the day, that Mr. Trump will probably lean towards the latter, even though Israel is clearly a liability of U.S. imperialism. United Arab Emirates is on the spot. Recall that they signed the so-called Abraham Accords, offering an olive branch to the Israeli expansionists. Of late, the UAE has upbraided and reprimanded and rebuked the Israelis because of this loose talk about annexing a good deal of the West Bank. We'll see how that unfolds. The Europeans are on the spot. Recall that Britain has been breathing fire of late rhetorically, once again, with regard to Israel and the genocide unfolding. But news reports suggest that there was a Royal Air Force refueling plane in the air over Qatar just before the Israelis were launching their attack, and Prime Minister Starmer will have to answer that question and respond and to tell us if that is an accurate press report. Just like it's hard to accept that the United States, which has a major military base in Qatar, that military base would not have had some way to see an incoming fighter jet coming to bomb a residential area festooned with embassies, consulates, schools, and the like. I think that it's possible, given the opening of the United Nations General Assembly as we speak, that this will lead to further criticism and, in fact, perhaps a uniting for peace resolution that the United States cannot veto, calling for more stringent sanctions of Israel, and, of course, the whole card being international intervention to protect the Palestinians. The Iranians need to ask themselves if they're next on the hit list. That is what is suspected. The Yemenis have been bombed regularly by the Israelis in recent days and weeks. And of course, the Yemenis have responded by bombing an airport in Israel proper. I think that the US left needs to engage in a tad of self-criticism. Recall that a major punching bag for the US left is what they refer to as identity politics. And yet Zionism is probably the highest stage of identity politics, if that term has any meaning. And yet the US left has been rather quiet and quiescent with regard to putting that label of identity politics on Israel itself. And that includes, of course, a man who used to live in Israel, who blamed the victory of Mr. Trump in November 2024 on the proliferation of identity politics within the opposition forces. I'm speaking, of course, of Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. I think we also should realize that Israel has gone beyond the ordinary bestiality of settler colonialism. Recall that during the 19th century in particular, when the United States was committing genocide against the indigenous groupings, one of their favorite tactics was to invite Native American leaders to a meeting and then execute them all. But Israel has gone a step further by bombing the mediators, not to mention the fact that they have made a practice of bombing negotiators. So there is a lot to ponder and consider with regard to this latest outrage by the Israelis. But I'd like to underline and underscore the United Nations General Assembly and the possibility of a vote in the General Assembly circumventing the U.S. veto in the Security Council that would call for international forces to intervene, not least in Gaza, in order to stop the genocide.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the Horn, we want to ask you about the second Africa-CARICOM Summit, which commenced this past Sunday, September 7th in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. This important summit, which you have been calling our attention to in the months leading up to the summit, brought together the heads of state and government from both regions. The summit is organized under the theme Transcontinental Partnership in pursuit of reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. Dr. Horne, what news should the audience be made aware from this important summit in Addis Ababa?
Well, first of all, we're still getting reports about the reparations discussion at this all-important conclave featuring leaders of the African Union on the one side and leaders of the Caribbean community led by Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago on the other side. I should also mention that Ethiopia seized the opportunity to unveil the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is a major step forward, not only for Addis Ababa, but for the entire sub-region. Recall that the late, great V.I. Lenin spoke of the potency of electrification, which this Grand Renaissance Dam will provide in spades. It still holds true that China has been a leader in electrification, and given the demands of artificial intelligence, which gobbles up electricity, this Grand Renaissance Dam could not have come at a more opportune moment. I'm referring also to the fact that in the recent Yokohama summit in Japan, featuring Tokyo on one side of the table and African leaders on the other, the Japanese promised and pledged to train 30,000 artificial intelligence specialists. And given, once again, the fact that artificial intelligence gobbles up electricity, we should expect the electricity demands of Africa to increase accordingly. Unfortunately, Egypt has been quite hostile to the construction of this dam. In fact, there has been scuttlebutt that Cairo would in fact like to bomb this dam. They conclude and they contend that this dam threatens their lifeblood, which of course is the Nile River. But those of us with longer memories recall that there have been conflicts between Cairo and Addis Ababa stretching back centuries. Now, with regard to the conclave between the African Union and CARICOM, it also reflects the South-South cooperation, which is becoming a hallmark of development in 2025 going forward. We expect that the leaders of these two blocs, CARICOM and the African Union, will move speedily not only to deepen trade and commercial relations, but also to remove visa barriers, to make it easier for travel between the Caribbean and Africa and vice versa. In that regard, recall that a few weeks ago, we highlighted the visit of President Tinubu of Nigeria to St. Lucia in the Caribbean. We should also note that this reparations demand is being pressed as the Europeans are on the back foot. I'm thinking of the government collapsing once again in France. I'm thinking of the deputy prime minister in London being forced to resign, not to mention the spiraling and escalating financial problems in Great Britain, not to mention a subway strike, which is still in motion, which has wholly and totally hampered economic activity in that capital. I'm thinking of the rise of Nigel Farage and his so-called Reform Party, a comrade of Mr. Trump, who apparently is leading in the polls, but if somehow he is able to prevail in upcoming elections, it will weaken Great Britain severely. And I'm also happy to say that there was a Black American delegation There were numerous Black Americans present in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for this important meeting, but I was in direct contact with the delegation from my old stopping ground, speaking of Berkeley, California, and certainly going forward, we'll be able to bring a more detailed report to our audience.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the Horn, we want to ask you about Venezuela. As we have discussed for several weeks, on August 18th, the U.S. military deployed more than 4,000 Marines and sailors to the Southern Caribbean and Latin America, and no fewer than 3 naval destroyers, along with a nuclear-powered fast attack submarine, spy aircraft, and a guided missile cruiser to the waters off Venezuela. The move comes after President Trump signed a secret directive authorizing the use of military force to carry out a regime change operation under a counter-narcotics guise, directed at Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, while at the same time President Trump put a $50 million bounty on President Maduro's head. In response, the Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez warned the U.S. not to, quote, dare set foot on Venezuelan territory, stressing that any action that violates Venezuela's sovereignty would be considered, quote, an aggression against all of Latin America and the Caribbean. And President Maduro announced the integration of the Bolivarian National Militia so that the militia is present in over the 5,000 communal circuits across the nation and can more effectively build a comprehensive defense of the nation. And on September 2nd, the U.S. military killed 11 Venezuelans in a strike on an alleged drug boat leaving Venezuela. Yet another reckless escalation and provocation against Venezuela. The Pentagon has also accused the Venezuelan Air Force of highly provocative acts, alleging that Venezuelan fighter jets flew near U.S. Navy warships. And in response, President Trump ordered an additional 10 stealth fighter jets to the military buildup in the Caribbean. And with the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, whose soon-to-be title is Secretary of War, recently stated that a military confrontation with Venezuela is, quote, not a question of if, but when. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis to this latest escalation against Venezuela and the Venezuelan people?
Well, I would urge the hotheads in Washington to cool their jets. They're getting in way over their head. They're trying to confront simultaneously Russia and Ukraine, which certainly we'll be talking about in more detail in coming weeks. We've just talked about the crisis in West Asia that could eventuate in another attack on Iran. And as if that were not enough, they're heightening tensions, not only with Venezuela, but I would say that the ultimate target is socialist Cuba, because we know that Cuba and Venezuela are very close. In fact, I would not necessarily expect what Mr. Trump is hoping for, an internal coup spearheaded by the Venezuelan military, not least because of the integration of Cuban intelligence, who are world class, into the highest ranks and the highest levels of the Venezuelan military. And that's not to mention that neighboring Colombia under President Petro has come out very strongly against a possible intervention. The military forces in Colombia are basically on alert, not to mention the guerrilla forces, such as the FARC, which have not been totally disarmed. I would also point Mr. Trump to the crisis and his allies, speaking of Argentina, where his comrade, President Milei, has been suffering grievously at the polls of late, not to mention the fact that his other comrade, speaking of the ousted President Bolsonaro in Brazil, is now on trial, and it does not look good for him, to put it mildly. Now, Mr. Trump may feel that in light of the ouster of the movement towards socialism in Bolivia, which suffered in the last election, in the last week or two, the fact that he has an ally, speaking of Mr. Trump, in neighboring Ecuador, that may give impetus and rationale for this particular contemplated attack. But with regard to Brazil in particular, our audience should take note of the fact that President Lula called an emergency summit of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, albeit a virtual summit earlier this week, with high on the agenda being these tariffs, not only being imposed at a spectacularly high level on Brazil, but on India and China as well, not least because those latter two nations have been dealing with the political commissar of the BRICS, speaking of Russia and their oil. I would also remind Mr. Trump, in terms of regional support for this contemplated brigandage, that it is true that Trinidad and Tobago has disappointed many of us by denouncing the Caracas regime, but he should pay attention to the elections in Jamaica just unfolding, where although the Jamaican Labour Party will be returned to the Prime Minister's office, they lost a number of seats to the PNP, the People's National Party, which of course stands to the left. And we all recall the heroism of Michael Manley some decades ago when he sought to affiliate with Socialist Cuba on behalf of the PNP. But the most telling aspect, perhaps, of this whole saga is the article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal just the other day, which talked about how oil giants in the United States are ecstatic and deliriously happy about the Trump regime because they feel that in store is the seizure of oil in Iran, the seizure of oil in Venezuela, and of course, they have pre-existing investments in neighboring Guyana. But I would warn those oil giants as well that there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and it's more likely than not that a contemplated attack on Venezuela will blow up in the faces of Washington and Wall Street as well.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about the news from this past Monday, September 8th, that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled for the Trump administration and agreed U.S. immigration agents may stop and detain anyone they suspect is in the U.S. In a 6-3 vote, the justices granted an emergency appeal and lifted a Los Angeles judge's order that barred roving patrols from snatching people off Southern California streets based on how they look, what language they speak, what work they do, or where they happen to be. The decision is a significant victory for President Trump, clearing the way for his oft-promised, quote, largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history. Dr. Horne, how concerned should we be regarding this ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court?
We should be ultra concerned. I mean, you should not necessarily see this as exclusively targeting those from south of the border, although clearly they are a primary target of the show me your papers rulings by the High Court. I'm old enough to recall what unfolded in the United States in the 1980s when the federal authorities seemingly were targeting Jewish American financiers such as Michael Milken, Dennis Levine, Ivan Boesky, and many of us concluded that this targeting was based upon the hoariest and most ancient of stereotypes afflicting those of Jewish ancestry. I don't have to remind this audience, I'm sure, about how Black Americans have been stereotyped, which obviously leads to our disproportionate incarceration, our disproportionately being targeted by police terror. And so this is a gigantic leap backwards by the High Court. I would like to point our audience to the dissent, the stinging dissent by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, of Puerto Rican ancestry, who, needless to say, stood tall against this kind of stereotyping. I hope and imagine that the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, which is heavily dominated by Mexican Americans, or the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, are already contemplating further measures to confront this wrong-headed decision. I would hope that they would not only look to the courts, which of course is probably a fool's errand at this point, but also look in the hemisphere and enlisting the government of Mexico, for example, because nationals of Mexico are obviously in the crosshairs, And Mexico has a skilled and talented diplomatic corps who I'm sure would be willing to utilize their talents on behalf of those being targeted in Los Angeles and other cities. Likewise, I would hope and imagine that LULAC and MALDEF would take their case to the United Nations Human Rights Commission as well, not to mention the Organization of American States headquartered in Washington, D.C. So this story is far from over, and I'm confident that our side will be up to the task and up to the challenge.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about the U.S. Congress's attack on the People's Forum. On September 4th, the People's Forum, which is an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist organization and a political education and cultural center located in New York City that describes itself as a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities, received a letter from Congressman Jason Smith and the House Committee on Ways and Means alleging that it has overstepped free speech protections and abused its tax-exempt status by peddling foreign propaganda. In response, People's Forum decried the probe as a, quote, desperate attempt to silence our work and crush dissent. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news? And how concerned should we be with these 2025 Black Scare/Red Scare tactics of not just President Trump, but the U.S. Congress?
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that since its inception, I've cooperated very closely with the People's Forum. I've spoken there a number of times. I've worked with them in producing written material as well, and will continue to work with them, I'm happy to say. Listeners and viewers may recall that it was some months ago that the New York Times primed the pump of this particular attack by launching a fusillade of invective against the People's Forum, charging that a major funder was supposedly headquartered in, wait for it, the People's Republic of China. In other words, they're trying to revive not only the Black Scare, but the Red Scare. Like the aforementioned decision from the High Court on racial stereotyping, we should realize that the authorities will not stop with the People's Forum, that that's only the first stop, and that all opposition ultimately is in the crosshairs. And that's why I encourage all in our audience to rally to the defense of the People's Forum, up to and including making financial contributions, because I've been led to believe that certain funders are now heading for the hills, which on the one hand is understandable, but on the other hand is lamentable.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about U.S.-South Korea relations. The South Korean government has negotiated the release and repatriation of some 300 of its citizens who had been detained on September 4th in a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement raid on a Hyundai factory in Georgia. It should be noted that this raid is the largest ever single-site immigration raid in U.S. history, with over 500 workers being arrested at the Hyundai facility in Georgia. The raid also attracted a good deal of attention, both because the Hyundai facility is a major economic driver in that state, and because it's rare for South Korean nationals to be targeted by U.S. immigration authorities. In this case, though U.S. officials are claiming that the people they picked up were in the country illegally, however, there's reason to believe that at least some of them were in fact covered under the U.S. visa waiver program. In addition, there still seems to be a fair amount of uncertainty around the ICE raid and its aftereffects, particularly whether it might chill South Korean economic activity in the U.S. The South Korea-U.S. trade deal calls for Seoul to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the U.S. economy over the next 10 years, which is going to be hard to do if South Korean nationals can't feel safe entering the United States. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of this historic immigration raid, targeting mostly South Korean workers, and what impact do you think this will have on U.S.-Korea relations?
It's a blow to Seoul-Washington relations, and it also exposes the contradictions of U.S. imperialism. In some ways, U.S. imperialism is analogous to African nations. You find that when China builds projects in Africa, they oftentimes send Chinese workers. And then you have the labor movement at times in Africa complaining, and you saw the same thing in Georgia. And reflects the changed correlation of forces with the rise of Asian nations, with the United States being heavily dependent upon Asian giants like South Korea and China for technology transfer, which overturns preconceptions about racial hierarchies. And at the same time, the United States demands technology transfer, but then disrupts it. The Republic of Korea had good reason to be concerned about exposing its intellectual property to the pirates in Georgia, which is one of the reasons why they sent their own executives and workers there. But in any case, this story has not ended, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.